Welcome, everybody. We have about 200 participants now. We have over 740 signed up, so I'm sure we'll be joined by others, but we are going to start promptly at 6, so as to respect everybody's time. My name is Chris Savage. I'm the chair of the Washtenaw County Democratic Party. I'm also the publisher of a collective blog, and I have a podcast called the GOTMFE Show. I'm here representing the Washtenaw County Democratic Party, along with my colleagues Teresa Reed and Janet Cannon, who are the co-vice chairs for precinct organizing. Ladies, if you'd like to say hi so everybody can see you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Yes, very thrilled to see you all.
The Washtenaw County Democratic Party is doing this in conjunction with the Liberal Leadership League. From L3, we have Lisa Dorado, Michelle Pallas, and Brian Watson.
Hi.
Hello.
I think I speak for all 6 of us when I say that this has been one of the most energizing projects we've ever worked on. We're just so thrilled to have such great participation. We really appreciate everybody joining us today. To get us kicked off, we have Art Reyes III. He's the executive director of We the People Michigan and We the People Action Fund. So Art, if you will unmute yourself, it's all you.
Great. Hey folks, really excited to be here today to introduce my friend Ian Haney López. My name is Art Reyes III. I'm the founding executive director of We the People Michigan and Action Fund. And before I kick it over to Ian, I want to just share a couple of stories that I think show why his work is incredibly relevant for our democracy, but especially for us here in Michigan. So one quick one, on January 21st, 2016, I was sitting in my office in Boston. I was at the time working for a national community organizing organization when a friend called me and said she had just left the house with an undocumented family on the east side of the city of Flint. They had just learned about the Flint water crisis that week when President Obama declared a state of emergency. They tried to get water from one of the official distribution centers that had been set up at the time, but they were denied access. They didn't have ID. Undocumented people had their IDs revoked in Michigan in 2008. And so they were denied water. It was a young family with an 11-month-old. The mother had been drinking the water and breastfeeding. Their child was sick and they didn't know what to do. And for me, this was visceral because it's the same neighborhood that my family had moved to almost 70 years before that, Flint as a beacon of hope. And here was a family not dissimilar from my own that wasn't looking for union jobs like my family had been. They were looking for clean water and there weren't plausible pathways to get it. And so, I ended up coming home working with folks across Flint with a number of folks, family, friends, people who I'd grown up with, launched a massive effort that became an organization called Flint Rising. But for me, one of the most important lessons coming out of that was a crisis of power. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a lost election. It wasn't a policy mistake. It was a crisis of power. And it also kicked off for me a period of reflection and the sense that I actually needed to be home. I needed to be back in Michigan. And Ian was one of the people that I met in this period, right after some of the work that I've been doing in Flint around the water crisis. Who I spoke to, who joined the advisory board of We the People Michigan, an organization that we were launching. And really importantly, and I think foundational for me, I read Dogmas of Politics, a seminal book that Ian wrote, and page after page after page resonated. And that influenced our work as We the People in some really important ways. As I don't have to tell many folks on this call, Michigan is one of the most segregated places in the country. As a state, we're between 75 and 80% white. Our largest city by far is Detroit, which is 90+% people of color, about 80% Black. And we have communities that had multi-generational economic devastation, like Flint, Detroit, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, that are virtually entirely folks of color, but also big rural parts of our state that have, by some accounts, the Upper Peninsula has been in a recession since the mid-90s. We've become fertile ground for a divide and conquer politics that tells some communities in pain the reason for your pain is other communities in pain. And some of Ian's work, the race class narrative framework, and some of his work previous to that really informed some of our thinking. The last thing that I want to share before I kick it over to Ian is I think all of us saw this very brightly in Michigan in 2020. I want to just take us back to paint a split screen on April 30th of 2020. On one side, a violent foreshadow, a few dozen armed white nationalists stormed our state capitol, attempted to force their way into the chambers where elected officials met. We saw men with long rifles looming over our state senators in the gallery. That same day, a different but equally foreshadowing gathering was happening via Zoom. Black, white, brown, native, newcomer, folks from every corner of the state joined in a digital action, a people's telethon for 8 hours. Black and brown folks sharing poetry, mourning loved ones. It was white and native folks in rural communities sharing about their mutual aid efforts. It was folks from across the state who are caring for their neighbors, who are taking action, who are pushing our state legislature to take action around COVID. About 21,000 people joined us over the course of that day. On the one side, you saw violent racist backlash, and on the other side, you see the future. Working class people fighting together for their communities and for each other. And when our democracy was under attack, as we all know it is right now, in 2020, when Michigan was at the center of that, it was many of those same folks who showed up, Black, white, brown, Native, newcomer, who stood up together and said that none of our voices are going to be taken away. The question for us is, will we be clear enough in what we have to do to make sure that we're actually protecting our democracy? It's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have Ian joining us today. He's one of the nation's leading thinkers on how racism has evolved since the civil rights era. His current research emphasizes the connections between racial divisions in society and growing wealth inequalities in the United States. He's the endowed chair as the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at UC Berkeley, where he teaches in the area of race and constitutional law. And he's the author of several books. I know many of you are familiar with them, Dog Whistle Politics being one of them that I mentioned earlier. His most recent book, Merge Left, fusing race and class, winning elections and saving America. And really importantly for a number of us here in the state, he co-founded the Race Class Narrative Project with Heather McGee and Anat Shankar-Osorio. And a lot of you in Michigan have become familiar with this through a variety of trainings. I know we have folks from the Liberal Leadership Institute here, but also folks like Hoyan Pham and Eli Day from the We the People staff who lead regular trainings via We Make Michigan, our state's race class narrative hub, which just a quick plug, we'll be having a training on Monday. You'll learn more about it at the end. But anyway, I'm incredibly excited to have Ian joining us. His work, his thinking, his advice has had an incredible impact on the work that we're doing here in the state. I'm just excited to welcome him. So let's give a warm Michigan welcome to my friend, Ian Haney López. So Ian, I will kick it over to you.
So many emotions listening to this. I'm getting caught up right now on the idea of a warm Michigan welcome from the California February point of view, but metaphorically, I know what you mean. In all seriousness, though, let me start by saying tremendous respect for Art and what he's doing, tremendous respect for Liberal Leadership League, Chris and the other folks who organize this. They've worked incredibly hard to pull this together, and in working with them just a little bit, it really gives me a sense of all of the energy and effort and stamina required to be on the ground and to be organizing. And I really want to acknowledge that, partly by way of saying thank you and partly by way of cabining my own remarks within a certain amount of humility. I'm a scholar. I've been actively involved in trying to think about what's happening to us. But at the end of the day, it's you folks who are really making changes in our country, and I'm very grateful to you all for that. All right, let me pivot to my talk. I'm actually gonna talk about race-class fusion politics. And I want to be really clear about this move from race-class narrative to race-class fusion politics. On one level, they're the same thing. On another level, they're a reset. And it may seem strange that as one of the founders of the original race-class narrative project, I'm talking about a reset, but I've heard from various folks that race-class narrative is being understood in a couple of ways that we really need to identify and be frank about. And one is that it's primarily or even exclusively a comms strategy, that it's a sort of a narrative strategy. And you can see where if you call it race-class narrative, that resonance is really strong. I'm okay with that. It is a narrative strategy. But I'm more worried about another misunderstanding that has arisen and for which I'm partly responsible. Many people I'm hearing from folks are saying, is race-class narrative a way to build a multiracial movement by talking about racism in a way that's palatable to white folks, that lets white folks off the hook, and that in doing so, actually pushes to the back burner the concerns of communities of color, that it downplays racial justice. Now, I'm coming out of a racial justice background. And when I was first thinking about this race class approach, and I was talking to unions, I was talking to the foundations, it really did seem to me that the challenge was convincing white folks that they had an equal stake in joining a multiracial coalition and fighting racism. And so as we set up the first race class narrative project, that was the sort of messaging we tested. But I really want to be clear. Race class narrative is not, well, let me actually say something else too. Why is there this sort of resistance to the idea that, or this sort of suspicion, let me say, why is there this sort of suspicion that maybe race class is just another effort to appeal to white voters while pushing a downward, while obscuring the concerns of communities of color? Because I gotta be honest, we all have to be honest, that's what's been happening in democratic politics for 50 years. So when racial justice activists hear somebody say, hey, I've got an idea, why don't you talk about racism differently? They don't even hear the rest before they say to themselves, oh, here we go again. So I really want to be clear. This is a way to understand what happens to us, what has happened to us, a way to understand movement building that equally centers racial justice and economic populism, and also, frankly, saving our democracy. And part of the way I want to do that is through this vocabulary of race-class fusion politics. I am intentionally trying to connect what we all are doing right now, what you're doing in Michigan right now, with what happened in terms of the fusion politics movement in the South in the years immediately after the Civil War. Because in that period, there was a 20 to 30 year period in which newly emancipated African Americans joined forces with, built power with, whites who had also been impoverished by the plantation economy of slavery. And together, they introduced and pursued progressive government in the South before it was ultimately destroyed by resurgent white supremacy organized by the plantation class. So I want to connect it to that. I want to connect up our current moment to Du Bois, to Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, to the multiracial organizing, the explicitly multiracial organizing that takes place in labor movements, in the farm workers movement with Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, right? So this is race-class fusion politics. It's a way of saying race-class narrative is first and foremost an analysis. It's a story of how we got here. It's an insight into how we got here. And building on that insight, it's a theory of social change. It's a vision of movement building. It's a sort of a strongly implied insistence that we build power across racial lines, and a warning about what will happen if we don't. And what's required to build power across racial lines? An effective comms strategy, a narrative, a way of expressing these insights to people, right? And part of the reason I'm organizing it in this way is because I really want to suggest, I really want to communicate, if people hear race-class narrative and think it's only a comms strategy, maybe they get it, maybe they don't, but it's just a set of magic words. Whereas if we say, this is first and foremost a story of what's happened to us, then it's a vision of how we can take care of our families, take care of our communities, protect our country. And now, in order to do all of that, here's a way of talking. We actually get much more buy-in into the race-class narrative. All right, let me come back to this issue here, the sort of, how did we get here? Well, where is here? Where are we now? I'm going to focus on this part, the democratic collapse. The title for this talk is Democracy Endgame. Not if we come together. It's Democracy Endgame. There are a lot of political scientists telling us what I think a lot of us feel in our bones. This is an incredibly dangerous moment in the United States. We stand on a knife's edge. And on one side, a redoubled commitment to democracy, but on the other, a collapse into authoritarianism geared to benefit the rich, but propped up on violent white nationalism. That's the moment we're in. Now, a lot of folks feel this, a lot of folks can see it, and frankly, a lot of political scientists, a lot of democracy theorists are saying, this is an incredibly dangerous moment. But what very few people are saying is, it's Republican dog whistle politics that brought us here. So we use, and I will talk about things like the Southern strategy and dog whistle politics, but we should be clear, those are euphemisms. That's polite language for what has always been racial demagoguery. And now here's the thing about demagoguery, about scaring part of the population by demonizing another part of the community. Racial demagoguery is a weapon not easily put down, because once you've picked it up, someone else can easily pick it up and use it not just against Democrats, but against other Republicans. And this is the radicalizing spiral that the Republican Party has been in for 50 years. And you can see it when you go from Nixon's silent majority to Reagan and the Reagan Democrats, and then you Newt Gingrich and the contract for America, on America, then to the Tea Party, and then to Donald Trump, right? Like, what was his strength when he won the primary in 2015? His strength was that he didn't think he could win the presidency. He didn't care what happened to the Republican Party. He was willing to go further than any of the so-called establishment Republicans in using the weapon of racial demagoguery. And even Trump right now is being flanked on the right, partly by QAnon, but partly by people like Ron DeSantis in Florida. There is a radicalizing spiral within the party that is in a call and response with the Republican base. So the sort of fury, the anger, the sense that democracy is a threat to many people in this country, and that if they had to choose between power for their group or democracy for the whole country, they'd prefer power for their group. We got there through racial demagoguery. That's part of the story I'm telling. Now, why frame it this way? A lot of the democratic theorists are responding to the crisis of democracy right now, and they're saying things like, we know how to solve this. We should get money out of politics. We should increase the franchise. We should stop gerrymandering. I agree. We should do all of those things. But here's the perversity of it. Many people who see democracy collapsing into authoritarianism are proposing solutions that require first that democracy be well functioning. But it's not. It's on the cusp of collapsing into authoritarianism. Is there anything we can do realistically right now? Come together. Come together. And I don't mean come together and get to 50%. That's not enough. The deck is stacked against us. We need to get to 58%. We need to get to 60%. But that's the one thing that is within our power to do, even in a democracy in crisis, especially in a democracy in crisis. Democracy endgame, not if we come together. Okay, let me continue with my talk. I'm going to back up a little bit because I really want to communicate this story of how we got here. I'm going to go back to 1964. Why 1964? 1964 is so important in terms of understanding what has happened to us in the intervening 60 years. So 1964, Lyndon Johnson, Democratic candidate, he signs the Civil Rights Act before the fall election, but also he campaigns not just on civil rights, but he campaigns primarily on a promise to use the awesome power of the federal government to end poverty, not in a generation. He says, we're going to end poverty before the country's bicentennial. What better way, he says, to celebrate 200 years of the United States of America, 12 years hence, than to use the power of the federal government to end poverty in this country. And standing against him is a Republican candidate, Barry Goldwater. And now Goldwater, he's an outlier among Republicans. He's a throwback. The Republican Party as a whole, by this time, has joined what we call the New Deal consensus, the New Deal consensus, the consensus that government should work for the majority of Americans, that requires regulating the marketplace, creating routes of upward mobility, supporting unions, and progressive taxation to push money downward and outward, to push power downward and outward. Think about a Dwight Eisenhower, for example, but not Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is a throwback to the Gilded Era. He's a throwback to an ideology that says it's the rich who know best how to govern society, and that the role of government is to support the wealthy, to do the minimum amount necessary to unleash the power of capitalism, and absolutely to do nothing to regulate the marketplace, to adjust power imbalances in the marketplace, and certainly not to tax people of great wealth and to push that money downward and outward. So this is Barry Goldwater, and he gets his butt kicked. I mean, this is an enormous landslide. He loses, and he loses big. But there are those red states. Barry Goldwater in 1964 articulates what comes to be called the Southern Strategy. And it's Goldwater who says, we need to go hunting where the ducks are. And what he means is, by 1964, the Republican Party could see that the gains of the civil rights movement that demands for racial equality for African Americans were causing resentment and fear among white voters, especially in the South. Now, this is in the midst of the civil rights movement. And Barry Goldwater knew that he could not stand up in 1964 and say boldly, plainly, I am the candidate of white supremacy, vote for me, and I will make sure that whites remain the dominant race for all time. He knew he couldn't say that, and yet he wanted to communicate it. And so he innovated. He communicated that message, but he used a dog whistle, terms that on their surface seemed silent about race, but that were designed to trigger a sense of racial anxiety, of racial fear, or of racial resentment. So, for example, Barry Goldwater talked a lot about states' rights. Now, I teach constitutional law at UC Berkeley. States' rights is a thing. It's federalism, it's a thing, but it's boring. You'd never run a political campaign on it unless you knew that your audience wasn't hearing some boring concept out of con law. But what they were hearing was instead a political leader reassuring them that you would roll back federal efforts to stop Southern states from using law and custom to segregate, oppress, and humiliate African Americans. And that was the warning in the night. That was the warning coming out of the South. These were diehard Democrats. They loved the New Deal. The New Deal had brought electricity to much of the rural South. And yet, here were diehard New Dealers, lifelong Democrats, voting for a Republican who promised to return to rule by the rich. when he appealed to them in coded racial terms. 1968. Barry Goldwater has lost big. Nixon barely squeaks through. Nixon, as a moderate Republican, he'd been vice president to Eisenhower, barely squeaks through. There's some movement towards these racist appeals, but Nixon doesn't lean heavily onto dog whistling. And yet, by 1970, Republican pollsters and Democratic pollsters alike look at the results of the election and they say to Nixon, racial appeals are your route to breaking the New Deal coalition. Use dog whistle politics, use racial appeals to try and pull the white working class out of the New Deal coalition that linked them with African Americans and with liberals. So Richard Nixon, he starts talking about states' rights. Then he starts introducing the Northern analog, forced busing, as if the issue is putting school children on buses. That's been happening for decades. Really, the emotional force of that was the integration, the racial integration the busing was designed to achieve. He starts talking about the silent majority, threatened by people who didn't respect law and order. Would it work? Would it work? Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide in 1964 when he promised to use the power of the government to end poverty in 12 years. Richard Nixon won in an even bigger landslide just 8 years later when he promised that the federal government would turn against racial integration. A lot of folks say we are fundamentally a conservative country, and we're a country that doesn't believe in liberal democracy, in welfare policies, in New Deal style government. Bullshit. It's not who we are. We're a country that does believe that government should work for most of us, for the vast majority of us, not for the very rich. But we are also a racially fearful country. And that fear has been easily harnessed to convince people that they're better off turning against their neighbors, turning against activist government, than risking the supposed dangers of a multiracial democracy. Let me fast forward. I'm coming up to the present now. I want to summarize what I'm trying to communicate about dog whistle politics. A lot of people think about dog whistle politics and say, I get it. Dog whistling is about racial appeals, you know, welfare queen, thug, illegal alien, gangbanger, CRT, critical race theory in schools. I get it. These are about racial appeals, and they are. But I also want to insist it's a class war strategy. We have to see that dog whistles aren't just about winning election. They're about promoting a particular ideology, an ideology that says distrust your neighbor, distrust government, distrust collective action, don't band together. Instead, fear each other, buy a gun, trust yourself to the tender mercies of the marketplace. This is the racial but also class war project of dog whistle politics. And these are the wages. These are the wages. This is what dog whistle politics has wrought. It's not just some marginal, oh, that's campaign rhetoric. This has real world consequences. One consequence is over here. We've been electing people whose main allegiance is to their dark money donors. And those dark money donors, there's a set of them who are absolutely reactionary billionaires. I'm thinking, for example, of the Kochs, the Mercers, the Scafeys. I'm thinking Betsy DeVos and Eric Prince. These are reactionary billionaires who believe in rule by the rich. And when we elect them or the politicians in their pockets, they govern on behalf of the rich, and we get levels of wealth inequality we haven't seen since before the New Deal. That's part of it. And the sum of us, Heather McGhee's book, brilliant, right? Heather McGhee, as one of the co-founders of the Race Class Narrative Project, absolutely a brilliant book in explaining what happens when we let racial fear turn us against each other and turn us against the idea that government should be working for all of us. But this too, and I want to spend a moment here because this is so important. We live in an era of racialized mass incarceration. We have 1/20th of the world's population. We have 1/5 of the world's prisoners. Why? A lot of folks who are racial justice activists, who are fighting racialized mass incarceration, they say, well, it's because of systemic racism or a culture of white racism or deep connections between the police and racial oppression. And those things are true. But I think even more important, even more a direct cause, the reason we have mass incarceration is because right around here, Richard Nixon starts talking about law and order. And then Reagan picks it up. And then to compete, Bill Clinton picks up this same rhetoric. We have politicians who campaign and win office telling stories of dangerous people, gangbangers, thugs, criminals, and then they govern by building prisons and by funding the police. And this is the new Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander's amazing, amazing book. The title, Jim Crow, might give you the sense of like, no, it's just continuity. But in her chapters, Michelle makes clear this was dog whistle politics that did this. Where are we now? 2022. We've got a new dog whistle that we have to fight, and it's a very, very dangerous one. The main dog whistles have been about threat, people of color as dangerous criminals, pathologically violent, or scarcity. People of color are taking things like welfare, their welfare cheats, not leaving enough for the rest of us. But there's a new dog whistle that those of us calling for racial justice, we don't really care about racial justice. That's a lie. What really motivates us is a desire for racial revenge. And so this focus on critical race theory, on Black Lives Matter, on the 1619 Project, and this vicious racist prosecutors, this is the language Trump used just last week to describe Black prosecutors investigating his crimes. The new dog whistle that we will face in 2022 is a dog whistle that says all of those folks asking for racial justice, they're liars, they're haters. What they really want is racial revenge. Fear them. They're a direct threat to you and to your children. And now the MAGA base, they love this. Of course they do, because even though this is a new dog whistle, it's a very, very deep, a very, very old fear, a fear that goes all the way back to the era of slavery, where there was always a sense that people asking for freedom or people asking for equality actually wanted to establish a new hierarchy with whites on the bottom, wanted to do with whites what the slave owners had been doing during the era of slavery. But notice, this is a story that appeals and is designed to appeal to communities of color as well, because it's a dog whistle that says there are good, decent, hardworking people in our country. And who doesn't want to be viewed as good, decent, and hardworking? But that also says There are people who are dangerous, who hate the country, who preach hate, who are anti-patriotic, who are violent, who are anarchists. A certain class of minorities, not all people of color, but a certain class of them, especially Black activists organizing for racial justice for the African American community. And you're seeing a lot of folks of color support that message. Every major non-white group increased their support for Donald Trump between 2016 and 2020. When we talk about the power of dog whistle politics, yes, we're talking about a political strategy that was designed originally to peel away the white working class, to pull them out of the New Deal coalition. But right now, today, we should understand very clearly, dog whistle politics has tremendous resonance within communities of color as well. And so how are we as Democrats, as progressives, responding? So here's part of it. This is a debate that's been going on forever. You've got some folks who are saying, hey, we need to focus on racial justice. And you've got some folks who are like, that's not my issue. I really care more about what government's going to do for me in terms of economic policies or what have you. That debate's been going on. But of course, Democrats aren't having this debate in a vacuum. They're having it against the messaging that's being promoted by the right, that liberals are engaged in racial betrayal, giving goodies to lazy, dangerous people and preaching hate. And so when we say we want racial justice for communities of color, very often the right says, told you so. These people are liars. They don't actually want racial justice. They want racial revenge. And then when you've got these people over here saying, okay, let's not talk about race. We lose white voters that way. It's divisive. And this is the sort of David Shores of current political wisdom. Let's talk about policy, the good things that our policies can get us. People don't hear, hey, good policy. They hear, oh, wow, they really are trying to give more things to dangerous, undeserving people. We've got to figure out. And so here you can see Democrats messaging against each other, but also playing into the right's message. Okay. Now, I can't like read and talk and, so I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to describe this. I hope you can read it all. This is a message that I worked with a Florida group to test in December. It particularly responds to an anti-critical race theory in public schools message. We tested a version of the GOP's anti-critical race theory message, and then we asked people, who do you trust more on schools? And the Republican message was up 11 points. So then we tested this message. And with this message, when we asked people, who do you trust more on schools, Republicans or Democrats? Democrats were up by 1. What's the hallmark of this message? It absolutely addresses race. And it absolutely talks about bringing everyone together. In other words, one part of the Democratic Party says, we're going to challenge that racism. Another part says, and we're going to talk about how we all benefit from this, bringing along as many voters as possible, including as many white voters as possible. And the key is shifting the threat, getting out of the framework that says people of color are dangerous and moving to a framework that says we're all trying to do the best by our families, no matter what we look like, no matter where we come from, no matter how long we've been here. But some people profit when they divide us, reject the lies, reject the division, build power across difference. That's the only way to take care of your family. That's the only way to actually build a community and protect our democracy. Or, and this is my last slide, and then we'll go to questions and answers. This is race class. This is race class fusion politics. This is race class narrative. In a nutshell, this is the same right-wing message. But now look, you can have people talking about racism saying that's just an effort to divide us. And the same folks can say, we're going to reject those lies and we're going to unite to build. They divide to conquer. We unite to build. That's the race class narrative. Understand it within this larger context. This is race class fusion politics. And I'm going to close here, but I really want to emphasize the power of the race class narrative is not that it's a set of magic words. The power of the race class narrative is that it's telling a deep, profound truth about what has happened to us. And it's a truth that people get immediately, viscerally, the moment we say to folks, we're so divided, not because we're terrible people, but because billionaires profit by promoting division. And they do it because that's their strategy for rigging the rules of the government and of the economy for themselves. And if you want to protect your family, if you want to build and strengthen your community, if you want to preserve democracy, we all need to stand together, build power across these supposed big deal differences, build power across those differences so that we can take care of each other. People understand the truth of that. That's the power of race class narrative.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. Give you a chance to catch your breath here for a second. We have questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to, we won't get to all of them probably. We are, we're gonna do this for about the next half an hour or so. So our first question comes from, let me bring her up. Juan Pam, she's a digital organizer for We the People, the group that the art is from. And Hua, you should be able to speak now, I think.
Awesome. Can you hear me? I think.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, cool. Yeah, yes. Nice to talk to you. Nice to see you, Chris. So as we all know, Michigan is a water wonderland. So it's surrounded by the Great Lakes. And that's something that a lot of us in Michigan are proud of. And like the rest of the world, Michigan is also threatened by global warming. We see it in the loss of our water, warming lakes, eroding coastlines, flooded basements, growing carbon footprints, travel disruptions that damage our outdoor and tourism industries. In Michigan, we've been working on race class narrative to talk about these issues, particularly during an election year through We Make Michigan, Magic, Liberal Leadership League. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the race class fusion strategy that applies to global warming, climate change, and those who resist fixing it and making it worse.
That is just such a great question. I'm gonna ask your question in a different way. But it really is your question. Think about the Green New Deal. Okay, so the Green New Deal says, hey, we need massive investment to avert climate collapse, and also we need to target those investments in a way that generates racial equity. And also, we should make sure to build the wealth of the working class, of working people. And now, some environmental folks are like, I just want to save the planet. And I get racial justice, I get economic justice, but none of that's going to make a difference if we can't save the planet. We have to be like, environment first. Environment, it has to be the main focus of all of us. But that misunderstands whence the source of threat to the planet. It misunderstands the strategy of Koch Industries. So Koch Industries, largest privately held petrochemical conglomerate in the United States, I suspect the world, they want to be able to pollute. How do they protect their ability to make money while polluting the environment and frankly driving us towards climate collapse? Sure, they have a lot of lobbyists. They put a lot of dark money into politics. But when Barack Obama came into office, he said, it's a new day. We are going to regulate these big polluting industries. So what did the Kochs do? They funded the Tea Party. The Tea Party. They put enormous resources, including institutional resources, movement building resources, into a movement whose main concerns were undocumented immigrants and Muslims and African Americans. And they used that to hamstring Obama. If you want to avert climate collapse, if you want to preserve climate, you need politicians who can stand up to the dark money being pumped into our democracy by the major polluters. And those politicians, the politicians we need who actually care about us, the only way we can get them elected is through a multiracial movement of working families. And the only way we can build a multiracial movement of working families is by addressing racism as a weapon of division and pulling people together with this race-class fusion politics to recognize that everything we care about, racial justice, but also averting climate collapse and economic justice, everything we care about depends on us providing a unified front against efforts to use race to divide us, right? And so race-class narrative, race-class fusion politics, and the environment, it's the only way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Our next question is from Ken Whitaker. He's the executive director of the Michigan People's Campaign, one of our sponsors. Ken, you can unmic and go ahead.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for being here, Dr. Lopez. You've talked about the ineffectiveness of the race left, calling out bigots. For some people, the first concern is racial equity and racism. It's essential, in their view, to call out the harm that is caused by racial prejudice, and that harm can't be ignored. So the race-class narrative takes a different approach that to them feels like pandering to the sensitivities of white people. Can you speak to them and their concern about race-class narrative?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. That's one of the concerns that I really want to address frontally. Let me, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen again. There's something important happening here, and I really want to be clear about what it is. What we're doing with race-class fusion politics is we're wrestling with a paradigm change. And when I say a paradigm change, we're wrestling with a paradigm change about how we understand racism. Now, when I say a paradigm change, I don't say that to suggest that the story I'm telling about racism is new or I invented it. It's not novel. This is a story about racism that we knew in the fusion movement after the Civil War, that Du Bois writes about, that Martin Luther King and Fred Hampton advanced, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, Reverend William Barber and the New Poor People's Movement. There's lots of folks talking about this. But I want us to be crystal clear on what this paradigm change is. And the reason to call it a paradigm change is because paradigms very often operate at the level of the unconscious. That there are things that we haven't closely examined, we take for granted, and that unless we surface these understandings, we tend to default back to them. Okay, and this has been happening in part with, frankly, with race-class narrative, but with all sorts of things, just the way paradigms are. So what is the primary paradigm that almost everybody in the United States has about racism? The primary paradigm is racism is white over Black and Indigenous and Latino and Asian American and Muslim, that it's a hierarchy. And now, drawing on that paradigm, you can see what the message of the right is. Yeah, white people should be the dominant group, decent, hardworking, law-abiding, our parents built this country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Make America great again, close the border. Right? You can see them emphasizing this paradigm. But what's striking is that many of us are also drawing on this paradigm, and it helps us understand this fight that's happening among Democrats. A lot of the racial justice folks are also drawing on a mental model in which racism is a white problem. And from this perspective, they say, we need to denounce white supremacy. We need to denounce systemic racism. We can hope that some few allies will come along with us. And I know some of you are allies for this sort of demand for racial justice predicated on seeing white racism as the main problem we face. But they're also willing to say, we're going to lose the majority of white voters. And that's okay, because they're racist and part of the problem. And so this is sort of one side of folks saying racial justice, but since white people are the problem, it shouldn't be a surprise when we lose white support. And now over here, you get these folks who are also drawing on this model of like the basic problem of racism is white over non-white. And they say to themselves, white people hold the vast bulk of power. Whites are the majority of voters. I mean, I think about like Michigan. Whites are the majority of Democratic voters. We cannot alienate them. And if to bring along white voters, we need to jettison concerns for racial justice, well, then that's what we're going to do. We're going to stop talking about police reform. We're going to stop talking about dismantling prisons. We're never going to talk about the border or ICE, except to say we support strong borders. This is the split. Okay, I'm going to go to this next slide. And the heart of the next slide is a different paradigm about racism. This is the fusion politics paradigm, and it really gets to your question. Are we pulling white people into a multiracial movement? Yes. Are we doing so by sacrificing racial justice? No. We're pulling white people into a multiracial movement by focusing on racial justice and by making clear that racial division is a weapon of the rich against all of us. Is the hierarchy there? Yeah. But it's so bad because it's being promoted by the Republican Party. It's being promoted by Fox News, by Tucker Carlson, by the Kochs, by the DeVosses, right? There's billions of dollars flowing into promoting racism. And again, when these folks get elected, they turn around and govern through systematic state violence against communities of color. And that's mass incarceration, it's mass deportation. Art mentioned Flint. Why has government systematically disinvested from communities of color? It's been a part of the right-wing narrative since the 1970s. Urban areas aren't deserving because they're populated by undeserving people of color. Right? Like the violence that we're experiencing in communities of color is driven by racism as a class strategy. And what does that mean if you're deeply committed to racial justice? It means that we can't have racial justice until we drive from office people winning power as dog whistle politicians. People win in office through dog whistle threat narratives. And what does it mean if you want to fight rule by the rich and make sure that all our children have a decent opportunity to thrive, have access to healthcare in a pandemic, have a climate which our children will be able to survive? You need to defeat dog whistle politicians. But this is, for me, obviously dramatic, like sort of simplification of what's happening. But for me, this is the central pivot of race-class fusion politics, to move from a model that says racism is primarily a white problem to saying racism is primarily a strategy of class warfare that succeeds when it promotes white over black hierarchy.
Excellent. All right, our next question is from Jennifer Austin. Jennifer is the chair of the Midland County Democratic Party. Welcome. Jennifer, you can unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi there. So my question, I live in a small city a very portion where the population is fully Republican. He is.
I'm sorry,
Jennifer,
Jennifer. I'm struggling to understand your question. You're breaking up just a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay now. Try it again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
It's a little choppy, but go ahead. Let's see.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what the problem is. So I live in a small city in a rural portion of Michigan where the population is like 90% white. The city's purple, but the county's heavily Republican. I've personally been harassed and intimidated many times simply because I'm a Democrat. And I feel that most of the politicians in this area, including the Democrats, I mean, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, they tend to take a racially homogenous approach to talking to voters. The voices of people of color in these areas are not only not being heard, but being actively silenced. Is there a race class story that we can tell in a rural white Michigan area?
Not only is there that sort of a story, but that's the story that's desperately needed. I think Art is doing some amazing work with We the People Michigan. I also want to lift up the work being done by George Gale and People's Action, an effort to specifically organize in rural America. Look, what's happening is that the right is talking about race all the time. And I think that has a lot to do with the virulence associated with Republican versus Democratic identity. You're talking about being attacked, targeted by people just because you're a Democrat. They're not attacking you because of policy disagreements. They're attacking you because you're perceived as the enemy. You're perceived as a threat. It's an identity story. The identity story from the right is a racial story. It's a story that says a lot of us are decent and hardworking, and many white folks hear that. Those are dog whistles. There wasn't race on the surface, but just underneath, it has a strong racial connotation. And we are beset, we're endangered by people who are lawless thugs who are ripping off the system as welfare cheats. So the right has this highly racialized identity story that answers three questions. Who are you? Who threatens you? Who's going to fight for you? Who are you? Decent, hardworking, law-abiding. Who threatens you? All of these people who look different, who have a different immigration status, maybe you have a different religion or a different sexual orientation or a different approach to the family life, right? So they're the threat. Who will fight for you? Politicians who aren't politically correct and who are willing to name the fact that these people who are different are also threatening and inferior. That's the identity story on the right. Can Democrats in rural Michigan respond to that by saying, we don't really want to talk about identity? I think identity is super distracting. We should talk to people about what great policies we have. Like, how's that going to work, right? And to be clear, talking about policy is also an identity story. It's just a terrible one, right? Like, what's the identity story of the policy wonks? The identity story of the policy wonk says, who are we? We're a whole bunch of different people with different interests. Who threatens us? Abstractions, systems, economies, markets, trade. Who's going to save us? That hero over there with the pocket protector and the briefcase full of amazing policy. Like, that's not an identity. All right. It's a sort of a, I once heard Van Jones say, you got a choice. You have Alien versus Predator on surround sound on one screen, or you can have Washington Week in Review over the radio. It's like, okay. In order to tell a compelling identity story, Democrats must respond to the racial nature of the right's identity story. And our identity story needs to be something like this. Who are we? We're people like others who look different and come from different places, who are trying to do right by our families and also to contribute to our communities. who threatens us? The people who intentionally stoke division and hatred through lies so they can profit and laugh all the way to the bank. And who will fight for us? Everybody willing to extend their hand across these lines of division, and political leaders who believe in us and bring us together. There is no other identity story that can stand up to the right's racial fear, circle the wagons identity story. And I understand circle the wagons. It's like the imagery is like sort of frontier cowboys and Indians. I'm intentional about that because it's a highly racialized story. We need a story that says we are right now a multiracial country. We are right now a multiracial majority. We have to lean into that, not as an accident and certainly not as a threat, but as our strength. And why is it our strength? Because we know our fates are linked. We trust each other. We respect each other. We're curious about each other. And when people try and divide us, we're onto their game. We reject the lies and we build power with each other.
All right. Excellent. Oops, click my video is not working. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you just fine.
My video seems to have gone wonky. Our next question is from my good friend, actually, Judy Daubenmeier. She's the chair of the Livingston County Dems. Judy, let me promote you. Judy, you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Professor Lopez. Thank you for being with us tonight. Michigan is very proud of a provision in our state constitution that guarantees every child a free public education without regard to religion or creed or race or color or national origin. But Michigan is also home to billionaire Betsy DeVos, who leads an effort for the last 20 some years to defund public education and to take public tax dollars and divert it to private Christian schools, despite a provision in our Constitution that forbids that. How can we use a race class narrative to defend public education and push back against this privatization?
Wow. Again, another really great question. There's a number of different things going on in the field of public education, and a part of them have nothing to do with race, but others, but in the main, this is another sort of racial dynamic. So you think about what we're asking of a democracy. And what we're asking of a democracy is that we see each other as people we trust, as people who share our fate, people that we can be confident in, even if they're different, that we know that if we share power with them, that, you know, if they win an election, we give them power. If we win an election, they give it back. In order to see people who are different as people you can trust, as people whose fate is bound up with your own, you need a critical education. You need to think critically. And what do I mean by critically? I mean the sort of education that pushes all of us to say, wow, I was raised with this set of experience and these sets of views and this religion and this cuisine, but it turns out that's not what everybody else has been raised with. Maybe I can gain a little bit of distance from my own sort of preferences, my things that are familiar to me, to come to understand why other things are familiar and valued by people that seem strange, maybe even offensive to me. That's the goal of critical education, to be critical of ourselves, to have some distance so that we can appreciate others, grow, make genuine choices about what our values are rather than simply inheriting the ones with which we grew up. I mean, we may hold on to those, but we'd also be equipped to think about changing those. Critical education is essential to a democracy. And we used to understand that about public schools, even K through 12, that we had to use schools to allow students, to encourage students to get to know each other across difference and to feel a common sense of purpose across difference, right? And I think there's some images that come out, that are sort of so quintessential. It's kids of lots of different races and genders standing together, putting their hands over the heart, saying the Pledge of Allegiance. The point of that was not uncritical fidelity to the flag. The point is, across all our differences, we're in this together. And so one of the reasons the right attacks public education is because it's attacking social solidarity. It's attacking the prerequisite of social solidarity, which is critical education. Another important factor, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but another important factor is the union, the political power, the NEA, the political power of teachers. That's an important countervailing force to rule by the rich, by politicians who are mainly indebted to the dark money billionaires. What makes it possible, though, to launch this sustained attack on public education? And here I'm coming back to the race part. Attacks on critical race theory today have their roots on attacks against Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. It's no accident that attacks on critical race theory helped a Republican governor get elected in Virginia, right? Like the tie between a narrative that says to white parents, racial integration, especially of African Americans, but of all of these hordes who look different from you, racial integration is a direct threat to your children. Protect your children. Withdraw them from public school, move to the suburbs, defund public education, fear your teacher. Your teacher is really indoctrinating your children to hate you, to hate the country. That rhetoric is incredibly powerful. Is there a race class response? Again, I'm convinced it's the only response. We have to understand the power of the racial story being told by the right about public education. And frankly, and here I want to go from the sort of defensive crouch of like, hey, we have to defend against this. I want us to stand up and have an affirmative vision. And what is that affirmative vision? It is an affirmative vision of an integrated society. We need to reclaim the civil rights ideal, the watchword of the civil rights movement, integration. And we have to understand, is integration just about helping communities of color? It's certainly about helping communities of color, giving them access to schools that have received the bulk of public support. But fundamentally, it's about building a demos, a people who believe in each other and believe in the project of democracy. We are a multiracial country. Can we become a multiracial demos? We can only do that if we recommit to, and this time genuinely pursue, racial integration, especially in our schools.
We have a question in the chat that was pretty interesting to me. Can you please discuss how religious identity fits into this paradigm, particularly Christian nationalism?
Particularly Christian nationalism? I want to, on the one hand, signal deep respect for religious traditions, especially many of the religious traditions that endorse social solidarity, care for the less fortunate, a sense of spirituality, a sort of a wonder and a humility in the world. But I also think we need to be quite clear-eyed about the way in which religion can be hijacked to purposes that are socially destructive. Now, scholars like Kevin Kruse have written about what happens with the evangelical church in the 1930s and then in the 1940s, the white evangelical church, when big money, corporations seeking a way to attack the New Deal began to fund pastors who would preach a version of Christianity that suggested that we're all on our own, that we don't owe our neighbors anything, and that regulation of the marketplace is somehow antithetical to Christian precepts. Fast forward now to Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. As we begin to integrate public schools, many white children are pulled by their parents out of their schools. Where are they placed? They're placed in what are called segregation academies. Most of those academies were affiliated with local evangelical churches. But precisely because this is the civil rights movement and the nation as a whole is coming to believe that blatant racism is an ugly moral stain, the language of segregation switches from an express language of white supremacy to a language of protecting Christianity, defending Christianity. So we get this language already in the 50s and the 60s. We get a language, a strong language that says we need to defend Christianity against assault by the state. And it sounds as if it's religious, but it's really racial. It's really a defense. It's code for, cover for a defense of continued white segregation, predicated on deeply internalized understandings of white supremacy. And then we get to the 70s. Richard Nixon supported abortion. The Republican Party supported abortion. But in the 70s, and especially by 1980 with Ronald Reagan, there was a sense that the party of big business, the Republican Party, the party of big business, could pull apart the white working class by recasting itself as a working class party, not on economic grounds, but on culture war grounds. And so you see the Republican Party endorse a religious right, but not a sort of an evangelical church with a tradition of care and humility, but rather an evangelical church with a tradition of patriarchy and homophobia. Today's white evangelical churches, they're the demographic group more than any other single demographic group in our country who vote Republican. And I have to say, if you're a white evangelical Christian, you're hearing messages of racial fear, of patriarchy, of homophobia, of communism and socialism as a threat to the economy. You're hearing that from the Republican Party. You're hearing it on Fox News. You're probably hearing it in your business, and you're hearing it from the pulpit. It's incredibly hard for anybody to stand up to that sort of propaganda, bombarding them from multiple directions 24/7.
Okay, our next question is from Watson, a member of our organizing team here. Brian, if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, and then we'll have time for just one more after that.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Aloha, Dr. Lopez. I understand that you were born and raised in Hawaii, that you went to Punahou, the same school that our President Barack Obama went to. Of course, Hawaii has this reputation for being a multicultural, multiracial melting pot. I wondered if you could talk about how growing up in that kind of an environment kind of informed your approach to race as you reached your later years.
You know, it's a excuse me, it's a great question. Yeah, so here's my real claim to fame. I overlapped with Barack Obama in high school. True, I was a freshman and he was a senior, but you know, obviously he looked up to me or didn't know I existed. One of those two is true. And I also overlapped with him in law school. And again, it's not clear he even knew I existed, but whatever. I'm one of the, I think I'm the only person who overlapped with him in high school and at law school. Hawaii, you know, it has a reputation. It is multiracial. It has never had a white majority. The only other state with that distinction is New Mexico. It has a reputation for being multiracial. I think that erases the power of colonialism and the sort of damage done by colonialism. It erases a history of race hierarchy among immigrant groups intentionally constructed by the large plantation owners, right? So there is this history there. I didn't learn it when I was growing up there. But when we really engage, we're like, oh, wow, this isn't a sort of a racial paradise. But there is a really important way in which growing up in Hawaii was sort of central to the way I came to understand race. So in Hawaii, I had a racial identity as somebody who was part white. My mother was from El Salvador, my dad's white. And in Hawaii, because there's so much racial mixture and mixed marriages, there's a racial category called Hapa Haole. Haole means white and Hapa is just kind of part or mixed. It wasn't until I got to the mainland and I did my undergraduate in St. Louis, Missouri, and then I went to the East Coast for graduate school that there was really a sort of meaningful identity as a Latino that was available because there were other Latinos present, and that because of this deep history of sort of the Latino presence in the United States. That experience of having my racial identity change, and then also growing up in a place in which there were so many different races and in which we talked about race all the time, really pushed me to think about race as something that is not fixed in nature, but that is socially produced, that is actively produced. And so you can see it in my early scholarship, but my first article is called The Social Construction of Race, because I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm coming from Hawaii and all of this is made up. Yes, we look different, but race isn't a function of what we look like. It's not a function of nature. It's a function of the social meanings imposed on what we look like. And now I want to connect that up to race class narrative, dog whistle politics. The insight that race is made up applies as much today as it applies to the 1600s. We are making up race right now. The right is making up race right now. I think maybe of the Muslim communities in Michigan, right? So if you think about how many people sort of Muslim from different countries thought of themselves before 9/11. Maybe they thought they were white and that's how the census categorized them. Maybe they thought they were mainly outside of race. But after 9/11, a rhetoric on the right developed that racialized Muslim identity, that used especially the portrait, the face of Osama bin Laden to create a dangerous specter, a boogeyman, the sort of a Muslim terrorist. We're inventing race right now. And it's not just, okay, this group that hadn't been racialized or that the racialization had been very complicated, now it solidifies. What it means to be white is being contested right now. What it means to be Latino as a race is being contested right now. What it means to be Black is in motion. And here I want to lift up a point. 1 out of 5 African Americans are either themselves immigrants or have an immigrant parent, 20%. So they're coming into a country with a long history of racializing African Americans, but they're also busy contesting it. They're shifting it. We need to understand dog whistle politics is about the social construction of race. It's about solidifying, rigidifying the idea that there is a white race and that white people are qualitatively different, better than, and threatened by these other racial groups. And what race class is trying to do is trying to say, no. Races are real, of course, they're socially produced, they're super relevant, but they are not a source of fundamental difference. We can connect as human beings across these lines of division, not to deny them, not to erase them, not to ignore them, but because we are building a multiracial democracy that requires a new understanding of race, that it's something that society does and something that we can change.
Okay, that is all the time we have for questions. We're now only 5 minutes past our deadline. That's not bad. Next up is, just before we move on, thank you so much, Professor. This has just been so great, and we're getting such great feedback in the chat. I think a lot of people are going to be watching this afterwards, so it's excellent. We have well over 300 people listening at one point. Ian is up next, and he's going to talk a little bit about how race class messaging and the race class political fusion approach is being utilized by the labor movement, something that gives me great joy. So Ian, if you'd like to turn your camera on and unmute yourself, you have the stage.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ian Haney López, for your work, which I teach at the University of Michigan. But I'm going to talk tonight not about the pedagogical uses of your work, but its use in the labor movement. I think you're exactly right when you argue that the 1% uses racism strategically to divide the 99% and keep them fighting one another. And what's true for the 99% in general is also true, I think, for the 11% of US workers who belong to unions. Now, union members are much more likely to vote and much more likely to vote for Democratic candidates. That's been true for a long time, and it's still true relative to their non-union counterparts if you compare controlling for race, class, and other variables. The union effect on support for Democrats is biggest with white men. Back in 2012 presidential election, Romney won white male votes by 25 percentage points, 63 to 38, but among white male union members, he lost to Obama by 10.5 percentage points. So it was a 35-point split for white men, based on whether or not they were union members. And I think, that's the good news, is that, if you are part of an organization that is providing a steady stream of information, analysis, and vision that competes with Fox and right-wing radio talk shows for the hearts and minds of working people, you're much more likely to be able to see through, the lies that you've been criticizing so effectively. If we had a lot more workers in unions, strategic racism would be much less effective than it is today. And I think that's the good news as far as it goes. But we do have to acknowledge that in 2016, while union members as a whole supported Clinton over Trump by almost 17 percentage points, and white union sisters did the same, their white union brothers went for Trump by 12 percentage points, 53 to 41. There's a real gendered dimension to this, which we haven't talked much about. And I hope that we can talk more about that. That many votes shifting to Trump can mean the difference between winning and losing in a purple state like Michigan. And was every union member who voted for Trump motivated entirely or mainly by dog whistle politics? Probably not. There were a lot of other issues, trade policy, not least among them. But was it an important contributor for many, especially whites and above all white men? Undoubtedly. I believe that inoculating our members against dog whistle politics is the single most important thing our labor movement can do to realize our core mission, building a US and a world economic system, given how much influence we have on the international system, that works for all working people by making that system much more accountable to organized workers and to democratic governments. Large-scale inoculation will not eliminate, and I don't think, the deeply embedded racial stereotypes that dog whistle politics triggers. And I think we agree on that. Just as the COVID vaccine doesn't confer total immunity to that disease. But what it does do, greater awareness of how dog whistling manipulates us, means that far fewer of us will end up in the ER, which I guess in this analogy would be the equivalent of voting for dog whistle politicians. So I think you and your team have provided us with two really powerful tools that help us with this work. A very clear analysis. I've never seen anyone as clear as you are about how dog whistle politics works, how it actually mechanically works. and emotionally works, and a growing body of evidence showing that coherent race class narrative beats dog whistle narratives among most Americans of all races. I think those are so important. Our labor movement really needs to pick up these tools and get to work with our members. Of course, we can do work with non-members, but we should take primary responsibility for our own members. There are plenty of them that are voted for Trump in both 2016 and 2020. The first step, I think, is alerting our leaders and activists to the existence of these tools and how to use them effectively. And I'm glad to report that there's already work beginning along these lines. UAW Vice President Cindy Estrada and top staff from the union's education department worked to develop a series of 6 workshops based on the short videos that you produced as you're in the Race Class Academy. 50 UAW staff have gone through those workshops already and are preparing. I'm not sure if it's happened quite yet, but they're going to be taking that into locals, right? With the work that they've done and the tools they've developed with those 50 staffers. And earlier this week, my labor federation, the Huron Valley Area Labor Federation, which represents about 50 locals in 4 counties, including Washtenaw, completed the 4th of our Race Class Academy workshops for delegates, which drew heavily on the work of the UAW based on your work. Now we too need to make sure that these workshops tailored to the different experiences of the widely varying members in those 50 different locals are carried back to as many of our affiliates as possible. And that's our intent, and we'll be working hard to make that happen. So thank you for all of the tools you've provided us, and we're 100% with you in terms of the necessity of taking this and placing this at the heart of our work as a labor movement.
I should have mentioned that Ian Robinson is the president of the Huron Valley Area Labor Federation. So Ian, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And you are somebody who inspires me as well. Okay, so next up is Lisa Dorado, and she is going to talk about next steps. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Professor López, for this terrific presentation. He teaches us a new way to think about race in America, and he mentioned this previously, by asking 3 questions. Who are we? We embrace a multiracial America. Who threatens us? The greedy few who divide us against each other while taking everything for themselves. Who are our allies? Everyone ready to join together and create a movement to fulfill the promise of an America for us all. Professor Haney López gave us the blueprint. Now it's up to us to unite and build. We're going to do the thing we know best. We will organize. And we're going to start with 3 items. You're going to get a follow-up email with all this information, and there will be links in the chat. So first, Professor Haney López created the Race Class Academy, 12 2-minute videos to teach you about the race class narrative. It's terrific. I urge everyone to take less than a half hour and watch these videos. Second, race class training from We Make Michigan is coming up in February and in March. This training is a deeper dive into race class, and it'll help you to be able to use it. I've taken this training. It's really good. I plan on taking it again. And links for that training are also in the chat, and they'll be in your follow-up email. And finally, Liberal Leadership League is exploring facilitating a coalition of organizations to collaborate and share information. We envision a Stacey Abrams type of coalition of grassroots groups to come together to share training opportunities, resources like Demcast social media, and race class messaging such as Anat Shenker-Osario's movement briefings. Together, we can develop race class messages based on Michigan issues to create a songbook so that our choir is in tune with our democratic values. If you're interested in exploring this area with us, you can click on the link in the chat and complete a short form. The link will also be in your follow-up email. You know, the coalition building already began with this event. The Washtenaw County Dems, Liberal Leadership League, and 13 partner organizations came together to bring you Professor Haney López. And we actually had, I think, almost 750 people register from across Michigan and beyond. And we want to thank all our partners. We accomplished that with only 15 organizations. Imagine what we could do if we had 50 or 100. We can coordinate, we can amplify, we can lift each other up. We can change the narrative in Michigan and let people know that we're a multiracial movement demanding that we all thrive, whatever race or class. We knew what it felt like, what a multiracial majority feels like. It's powerful. Remember the hope we felt when we elected President Obama? Remember joining together Black, White, and Brown, led by Black activists in Black Lives Matter demonstrations? We did it before, we can do it again. We're the ones we've been waiting for. And today is the day we start. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's awesome. I'm really looking forward to where this goes. And so I hope everybody does answer that survey and our follow-up email. I'm going to launch a short poll here. First of all, thank you again, Professor Ian Haney López, for joining us. We can't thank you enough. If I could get Janet and Michelle and Brian to turn their video on, and everybody just sort of do a silent applause in your little Hollywood Squares thing. But thanks, everybody. You guys have been just such a joy to work with. So inspired by every one of you, and I can't wait to do other stuff.